So, as we said before, picking up about this Reimarus and his historical Jesus work, his big claim was the kingdom of heaven and the preaching that's involved. Jesus must have known that if people believed his message, they would be looking for some kind of a validation, some kind of a deliverer, an earthly deliverer. And Jesus believed that part of it was him functioning in that role. And so the Messiah, Jesus as a Messiah, would have been a political figure. And uh, Reimarus believed that Jesus shared a lot of the ethnic exclusivity of the Jews. That Jesus built that into his program. That that the later church then had to expand that after Jesus's death. And so these things that we regard as institutional teachings in the church, like the Last Supper, they're not to be treated as institutional or dogmatic points of view or teaching, but rather a meal in the not a sacrament. Certainly, the Last Supper was no sacrament, according to Reimarus, but rather the inauguration of some totally new age. But it doesn't happen. Reimarus remarks that the sum of Jesus' anticipation can be revealed in the sending out of the 12 when they're sent to do their mission work, and they have a little bit of success, and that builds in terms of its anticipation towards the future. And so the disciples are prepared for what is about to unfold in this kingdom, but it does not come to pass. And so Reimarus sees the disciples as holding this hope, holding this eschatological hope on behalf of Jesus, and then this is how the church begins to grow. So Reimarus, a very important figure here in the quest for the historical Jesus. Bruno Bauer and F.C. Bauer. Bruno Bauer and F.C. Bauer are two, and Bruno Bauer was a philosopher, I mean, he did everything. F.C. Bauer is mainly an historian and theologian. And so they teach Jesus in similar ways. I'm going to talk first about Bruno Bauer, who sees Jesus as a simple moralist, someone who just does the teaching, and you can, never meant to create such a stir. His preaching about the end of the world was always meant to be a spiritual kingdom, a spiritual teaching that the disciples and the church began to institutionalize. F.C. Bauer looked at the Gospels and he looked at all of the New Testament with and through a Hegelian dialectical mindset. And so he looked at the text as a push and pull between Paul on the one hand and Jesus on the other. And so the Gospels represent maybe a pullback on the part of the early church. So Jesus becomes a figure that is going to pull back against Pauline Christianity. And this is the division in the early church and the tension between Gentiles and Jews and the whole thing. F.C. Bauer points in that kind of direction. So that's a quick nod to F.C. Bauer. We get to, however, a big player, and that is David Friedrich Strauss. David Friedrich Strauss, he studies with Hegel, only to have Hegel die after 3 years of being there. And he publishes his Life of Jesus, and it is unbelievably controversial because Strauss has picked up on both Reimarus and Lessing, has looked at the text for himself, and has decided that the miracle stories are not pointing to anything that would have taken place within history. Now, a quick walk through some of the other, and we're going to come across Ernest Renan in just a second, but people in the Life of Jesus research, and the definitive work on this, of course, is Albert Schweitzer, who we'll get to in a few minutes, his quest of the historical Jesus. But people had been rationalizing the miracles of Jesus as they walked through the text. So let me give you an example of this. One example is the feeding of the thousands, right? So in some of the teaching stories, you have different apostles or different conjurings of this miracle. The miracle is that Jesus had enough food to feed everybody. Oh, it's not a problem for the rationalists, though. The rationalists view the miraculous through a rationalist lens. Here's what they will argue: Jesus had his back to a cave where all of the bread and the fish had already been brought and stored. When Jesus blessed the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he then went back to the storeroom and had enough for everybody. So this is one example of how a classic miracle story is really something else entirely. There really aren't demonic possessions. There are people who suffer, and Jesus' healing touch removes them from, they come to themselves. So you've got rationalism playing through this miracle story. Strauss doesn't take that at all. He looks at the stories of the feeding, the bread and the fish, and then John 6, and he goes right to say this is a teaching of the church. And the teaching of the church is that Jesus provides his followers with spiritual food. So almost an entire distancing from what, and he said you can't know what the original Jesus was doing in that moment because that isn't what Jesus, that's not what the church records. So a spiritual or mythical rendering of Jesus's life embedded in the Gospels and on behalf of the church. So Strauss's Jesus is extremely it's very, very controversial. He gets bounced out of a teaching position so fast, and he spends the rest of his life going. He does marry an opera star, which was an interesting, a little divertimento. But there are some gains here. First gain is seeing the history of the canon. That is, understanding that the books of the New Testament were ratified in a certain order and in a certain progress that the institutional church was aware of. This is something that hadn't been considered in the gospel historical Jesus quest. Another gain from Strauss and from others is the uniqueness of each of the New Testament documents. Mark. Why does Mark's gospel, Jesus doesn't say anything about his messiahship until he heads to Jerusalem? Had he kept that a secret? What is it that's unique about the mission of the 12? Does the mission of the 12 and its success fill Jesus with the anticipation that his overall mission may be successful when he heads to Jerusalem? Is there a hope there that now that we've reached some kind of a critical mass in Galilee, we'll be able to move south to Jerusalem and it'll all work out? Mark picks this up. Matthew and Luke subscribe to the same basic scheme. John diverts from that. Strauss, for whatever conclusions he draws, he points to the uniqueness of each of the New Testament documents and allows them to speak for themselves. And then, of course, picking up for F.C. Bauer and also Hegel, the historical development is seen through the lens of tension, and that is thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And so for Strauss, the Gospels that we have are synthesis. That is, each of those Gospels is a synthesis from what had happened. Of course, the original tension happened with Jesus and the first disciples and the cataclysmic moment of his death, and the reckoning of what that meant for those particular people. So historical development was something that you could trace, you could see in kind of literary artifacts. Was a very important contribution that Strauss made. Ernest Renan is one example of the romanticized view of Jesus. And Renan is just one. There are so many, and Jesus is a philosopher. He is a wisdom teacher. He is an every person. I mean, and Renan is even more pronounced. He talks about the green grass, the rolling hills. I mean, everything takes on this kind of like, almost like a movie scape where it doesn't look like that. By the time he's done, it does not look anything like, this is my opinion, doesn't look a thing uh, like Jesus would have actually looked had he had the chance in the first century. All tension is gone. All this notion about this coming kingdom and the eschatology and all that stuff. Jesus looks like just somebody who got caught in the wheels of time and got ground up. He was a great guy. Well, how did this happen? Renan is one of those romanticized views of Jesus. There are so many of them that pop up in the 19th century. They sold like hotcakes. Two scholars that we want to mention, Adolf von Harnack and Johannes Weiss. Harnack is the voice of classical liberal Jesus scholarship. Jesus taught God's intimate presence. Jesus was the model for this inhabiting God's presence and spiritual consciousness, right? This idea of monotheism and the triumph of true religion as opposed to the false. So that true religion was a monotheism that was devoid of the law and liberating from this Jewish ethnic kind of designation. He was a role model for spiritual life and harmony. Johannes Weiss, on the other hand, goes back and picks up on Reimarus and Semler before him, that Jesus was coming to proclaim a future kingdom, that ethics were heroic and pre-cataclysmic urgencies. That is, the ethic that Jesus talked about, this really stringent Matthew Sermon on the Mount kind of ethic. Love one another, forgive one another, all of the high kind of follow this ethic was born of the idea that the cataclysm was around the corner, that God's judgment was impending. Jesus then looks like a fanatic apocalypticist, expecting for the heavens to fall in on themselves. And so for Jesus, this cataclysm was going to bring forth this new heavenly kingdom. And Johannes Weiss is the one to connect the apocalyptic mindset, right? This Jewish apocalyptic view with a coming and a rejoining of heaven. This is Weiss's real contribution here. He ties Reimarus's eschatology to the Jewish apocalyptic theology that was on display in the first century. That is his real contribution. Albert Schweitzer, he's such a slacker. I mean, he's a biblical scholar, first-rate concert organist. He's changed the field of Paul studies and gospel studies. Concert organist, a medical doctor, missionary. Wow, what a guy that wastes the time. His giant book, Quest of the Historical Jesus, his giant book talks, really catalogs all the other quests. And then at the end, he kind of puts his stamp on it. He says that the coming kingdom forced an interim ethic. That is, an ethic that was just for the time when Jesus was around. Personal sacrifice to inaugurate, to usher in the kingdom. Jesus' own personal sacrifice and his disciples, in order to get God's kingdom to come. Jesus, though, is a failure as a Messiah. He's a failure as the Messiah of the end times, but a model of devotion to the kingdom. That is, he goes all the way. And Schweitzer says Reimarus was right about Jesus' eschatological frame of mind. Absolutely, completely correct. But Schweitzer's analysis is that Jesus, in taking his, and by the way, all these folks notice the things that the synoptic gospels, the synoptic problem, all those things are fuel for the fire for the particular presentations, trying to discern what each gospel writer had to contribute and how it works in terms of the grand scheme and together. But Albert Schweitzer, by far, to me, is a real downer, because at the end of his book, he says Jesus was a prophet who was awaiting for God's kingdom and thought that when he went to the cross as God had led him, that God's angel army would come swooping down to save the day. And when they don't, Jesus dies pathetically and alone. What a bummer of a point of view. So that's Albert Schweitzer. And Schweitzer is the one who says that all the previous quests look like the people who wrote them. and there's no argument there. But that completes the first cycle of Jesus quests, and we'll come back on and talk about the subsequent quests in the next couple of lectures.